Gord, we'll go back to Mr. Kent to respond to the amendment to the motion.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to thank Ms. Ramsey for proposing certainly what I consider to be a friendly amendment to the motion, and Conservatives will accept that proposed amendment to the motion and vote for.
So we'll go to Mr. Erskine-Smith to respond to the amendment. Go ahead.
Mr. Blakey, of course, I'm not just going to let people quote Liberals. I'll say something myself. Although Mr. Kent and Mr. Wellev, you sound great quoting Liberals in comparison to your normal selves. In jest. I want to start actually by agreeing with Mr. Kent. It is outrageous that there's a leak with respect to the Supreme Court judicial appointment process, and without question, that kind of leak undermines the confidence in the judicial selection process and appointment process. So I think people from all parties ought to condemn that kind of thing. Completely inappropriate. I also want to acknowledge, I've voted for a more public-facing inquiry to get at the truth, but I think everyone on this side cares at getting to the truth. It's just a question of how we can best do that. And so you'll remember, Mr. Kent, informally when the SNC story started in the news, I had come to you and come to Mr. Angus and said, is this something that you think we would look into? And I think if at that time, before justice was seized with it, if at that time we had seized it instead, we would have absolutely been an appropriate forum, and then the waiver would apply to this committee. And I can speak for myself. I don't know that it would have been closed down quite so quickly. But the fact of the matter is we are where we are now, and the waiver does not apply to this committee. And more than that, I didn't hear anyone say today already that Ms. Wilson-Raybould has written a letter to the Justice Committee and said, not only do I have more to say, but I am going to say it. And no one is going to hold her back from writing a submission to justice, providing emails and text messages, and having spoken with Mr. Housefather and also seen his public statements, I understand all of that information is to be made public. And so for me, in my previous lifetime as a lawyer, we would call motions like yours, Mr. Kent, premature. But to me, it makes far more sense to see what is said in that public statement, to see how justice reacts to that, frankly, and whether they think any of that new information is something worth reconsidering their previous decision to close off their study, and for us to, if necessary, revisit this conversation. But frankly, at this time, justice is seized with it, the waiver applies, and there are more documents forthcoming to justice. It seems like we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves at this committee when, even if we had Ms. Wilson-Raybould and Ms. Philpott sitting there, I know, because they take their oath very seriously, having spoken to them both, that they're not going to be able to say anything to our committee because of the oaths that they've made and because the waiver doesn't apply. And even if a similar waiver applied to our committee, we'd be relitigating, with Ms. Wilson-Raybould in particular, we'd be relitigating the very same information that she's providing, not only that she provided in person, but that she's now going to provide in writing. And so my view would be twofold. One, I think this is appropriately before justice, and we ought to wait and see what justice does in the wake of the additional information that is provided. And two, and not everyone here today has been part of our inquiry into Cambridge Analytica, but I've said this publicly in interviews already. I have not found committees like ours to be very effective at conducting inquiries. When we had AIQ come before us and they provide written documents, the ability for our committee to do the work of effectively a commissioner, it was very important for us to do that kind of work and to pass it off to the privacy commissioner. But for us to conduct that inquiry ourselves, we clearly ran into roadblocks and were unable to proceed based on our inability to compel documentary production in the same way, our inability to revisit testimony in the same way. Frankly, the tools we have at our disposal are more cumbersome, and the privacy commissioner was well placed to pursue that further. In this case, what can we do if we want to get at the truth as far as this committee is concerned that is within our purview? Well, the Ethics Commissioner reports to us. And the Ethics Commissioner has undertaken, as I understand, in a letter to Mr. Cullen and to Mr. Angus, that he's proceeding with an investigation. I know that the Ethics Commissioner is to attend before this committee for estimates in early May already. If we want to bring him here earlier, so be it, if that's the will of the committee. But certainly I think it's fair for us to ensure that the Ethics Commissioner has the tools, resources, and mandate to do his job effectively and to do his job in a timely fashion such that we are able to get at the truth. When I voted the way I did for a more public-facing inquiry, it was because I did not think that committees were best placed to do this kind of work, and I thought that an independent, nonpartisan, commissioner-style process was much more effective. And if the Ethics Commissioner doesn't have a full mandate to do this kind of work, we can ask those questions. We can ask him about the limitations that he might have to his mandate, and he can express concerns if he has any. And I think that fundamentally is the job that this committee should undertake with the current waivers as they apply and with the status quo as it is. And if additional documents and testimony are produced that would make me change my mind, then so be it. But as I say, I hate to be technical, but I think the motion is premature.
Thank you, Mr. Erskine-Smith. To respond to that amendment, once again, Mr. Kent.
Well, thank you, Chair, and I thank the Vice Chair of this committee for a very thoughtful response to the motion, to the presentation by all members on the opposition side of the table. And I sense that I see the direction that he and his colleagues will take in terms of voting on this motion and the amendment. But he should not be surprised that I disagree with him on a number of points. First of all, it is true that the Justice Committee has agreed to receive the transcripts and records offered by Ms. Wilson-Raybould in response to other witnesses before that committee, but the waiver has not been extended to allow her to respond to those still important issues that both she and Ms. Philpott say they wish to speak to. And our motion says in B that a formal request be made by a committee chair, by our committee chair, to write a letter to the Prime Minister and to request that he waive all constraints that would apply to any individuals that the committee may decide to invite, whether it be Ms. Wilson-Raybould or Ms. Philpott primarily, or to others who I believe do have a right to respond to Ms. Wilson-Raybould's testimony, as well as to the clerk and to the former principal secretary. With regards to the AIQ investigation, I agree. This committee did not have the tools or the authority to demand completely honest responses from the executives of AIQ, and we stated such in our report. They were unwilling witnesses. There's no question about that. They had to be dragged kicking and struggling to come back before this committee to not answer questions that we still had. I think certainly in the case of Ms. Wilson-Raybould and Ms. Philpott, we have willing witnesses that are anxious to present testimony. And if indeed the Justice Committee in reopening or accepting and releasing the documents that Ms. Wilson-Raybould will table sooner or later, there is a possibility, although I sense it's remote, that they would reopen their study to include a request to the Prime Minister to extend the waiver or to remove entirely all constraints on their testimony. And third, with regards to the Ethics Commissioner's investigation himself, I think he has expressed in his appearances before us within the last year, the last half year, his concerns that he doesn't have the necessary authority to conduct investigations to the extent that he would like, and that in fact his not only his order-making powers, but the penalties that he may apply are rather modest. So, although again respecting and I appreciate your remarks with regards to agreement on the leak regarding the judicial appointment process, I think I would still urge you to support the motion before us today, with the understanding that it would not interfere or conflict with whatever remaining study the Justice Committee may wish to, although again, I say I'm not not optimistic that beyond the release of whatever Ms. Wilson-Raybould intends to send to them, I'm not optimistic, given some of the statements by the members of that committee when it was shut down, that it might be reopened.
Thank